Okay, so I've had a lot more time to play around with FSR 3. I have a lot more thoughts. Also, I've got two PCs hooked up to this screen right now so that we can actually try out an exact A/B testing. On the same screen, playing the same game. I have a 7900 XTX based system right here running FSR 3 with frame generation, and then if I click the correct amount of input switching buttons, right here, we'll switch to the other input where we now have a RTX 4080 based system playing the same game. This is Immortals of Aveum, one of the two games that actually has FSR 3 right now, and the only one that also has DLSS 3 frame generation available to side-by-side test. Probably also hear my kids in the background. That's just how we roll over here. Anyway, so the idea is to immediately get some A/B testing thoughts between the two, but also just like more thoughts on I've actually just played this game for a while using the, FSR 3 to just get a feel for it. And the main question we want to answer in any sort of a review for FSR 3 is it worth using? Is it better to press the frame generation button than to not press the frame generation button? Anyway, let's go ahead and play around with this for a minute. Okay, there is absolutely no way to correctly display 120 frames per second on YouTube. So with that in mind, we're gonna do the best that we can. I'm recording at 120 frames per second, but you know, that'll just capture what it can capture. So here's the first thing, is that, let me get the remote here to pop this thing open. One reason why we're doing a screen capture is just so you guys get the idea that you just aren't gonna be seeing what I'm seeing. Like it's, when we do gameplay capture directly, a lot of people just don't really understand that. Second of all, like I mentioned in my last video, there's some interesting ways you're supposed to set up FSR 3 that's a bit different than how you set up DLSS 3 frame generation. With FSR 3, you're actually supposed to have VSync turned on, and ideally you'll be kind of hitting your monitor's maximum refresh rate. Also, the frame time graph goes absolutely nuts, but it's supposed to, and that's okay. It doesn't mean you're actually getting those kinds of stutters, and there is AMD documentation just saying that it just doesn't report correctly to software monitoring stuff. So here's the first thing I want to say. So this is the 7900 XTX based system. Notice that right now frame generation is off. We're around this 80 frames per second mark, and then notice that we have FreeSync enabled, and it is a variable refresh rate. These don't always match up perfectly because the way they report can be differently, but you get the idea. Now here's the thing. When I run this smoothly, like the main idea you'd want a higher frame rate, I mean 70 already feels pretty good, is because, you know, there's jumps in between each frame during fast motion. So the main reasons why you would want a higher frame rate in a game is to smooth out the image between those fast moving frames, right? The other reason would be to increase responsiveness, but this just doesn't do that. Frame generation from both teams, red and team green, both increase input latency, they don't decrease it. Anyway, so kicking on frame generation and backing out here, you notice that with VSync enabled, we're now at about 120 frames per second. We're locking to the monitor's max refresh rate. And as I spin this, again, this is mostly a subjective thing that I'm just able to tell you. But I can tell you that despite us sometimes dropping below the 120 refresh rate, and this not necessarily free syncing to that now, because that's another thing I wanted to show you, is that with this enabled, it now does not free sync properly. Notice like we're at 109 here, it's just locking to 119. And just in general, as soon as you enable frame generation, like here, if I go back to native AA, where we're gonna be very clearly below here, right? This is no frame generation, right? We can see that we're variable refresh rate. As soon as we kick frame generation on, you'll see that we now lock to 119 despite the game not running at that, so it does not properly do variable refresh rate. In other words, FreeSync isn't really supported, and neither is G-Sync, which I showed you in my last video when you're running FSR 3. Occasionally it shows up as like 80-ish for a split second, and then it pops back to 119. I think it's just weird reporting. But the point is, as we go to FSR quality, again, with FrameGen off, we are free-syncing properly, and it looks like this. Again, I can see in person, you probably can't, or as much in a YouTube video that's locked to 60 frames per second, that there's, you know, gaps between frames on fast motion, and when I kick frame generation on, here's the main thing. It is visually smoother. And when I'm at this high of a frame rate and it's near my 120 and I'm using VSync, in general, running around playing with this does feel very smooth. Now, the other issue can be latency, and I do not have a way of hardware monitoring latency. But I can tell you that in a single-player game, this feels very responsive, and here's the #1 thing we need for an FSR 3 review. Would I rather play with it on or with it off? So here's the thing. If I turn, I have been playing this game for hours now on the setup, basically doing this, playing for a while with just normal quality upscaling. So I'm around this, base frame rate around 70-ish, 60s to 70s-ish, jumping around, doing all that, playing the game. And then I have been doing the same thing with frame generation on for a while. And basically my conclusion is I prefer playing with frame generation on. So overall, DLSS 3 frame generation, FSR 3 frame generation for me is a win in the sense that, at least in this game, I would rather turn it on than turn it off. So then the other question can be, okay, but how does this experience compare to NVIDIA? So that's where I can switch my inputs here. And if I go to HDMI 2, we are now going to also switch the mouse and keyboard that I'm using, slide these ones out of the way, and we are now running on an RTX 4080. This, if I pop open my menu now, shows that we are, again, we're using G-Sync now, we're all in the same situation. Again, these variable refresh rate numbers don't always perfectly match what you're seeing here. I've noticed, especially with G-Sync, they seem a little bit more different, but the point is it's very clearly is doing variable refresh rate, and I'm not seeing screen tearing, so it does seem to be working. But the point is, here's the difference. With NVIDIA's frame generation implementation, DLSS 3 frame generation, here we're DLSS quality frame generation on, you cannot enable VSync through the game, although you can force it on a G-Sync capable display through the driver panel. Now that really matters most if you're going beyond your monitor's refresh rate, this one being 120, and currently we are not doing that. But the point is, I can now just kind of directly compare, swinging back and forth with this on, with this off, and I've been playing the game back and forth on this setup, kind of doing this sort of A/B testing that we can do here. Oh man, I jumped down. Anyway, one thing I can tell you is that in this particular game, at least, the 7900 XTX does seem to be faster, although generally they're pretty close. I could go ahead and upscale further to push frame rates farther, and that's one thing. Well, I will say, I'm still going to say advantage NVIDIA, is that I think I can push the upscaling much more aggressively, especially at lower resolutions, but here we're playing at 4K, than I can on the FSR 3. Let's go ahead and switch back to that setup for a second. And the main thing I've got to say, though, is they're both offering a pretty good experience, and I think the biggest differences that I can see are in the actual upscaling quality itself, rather than the frame generation implementation. This is also feeling very smooth, and I'm not seeing a lot of motion artifacting. Now, if I try to push the upscaling more aggressively on the AMD system, I do think that it falls apart a little bit more in motion, but that's mostly the upscaling quality, not the frame interpolation. So, and that's where I think that they could do the most to improve this. So basically, my conclusion right now is that I would rather turn frame generation on than off, as long as I can achieve near a lock on my monitor's maximum refresh rate with FSR 3. And again, A/B testing it, not doing a recorded side-by-side, which is very difficult to do properly on YouTube or just to capture it in general, but a purely subjective, just like, how is the experience? I mean, they both feel like they increase the smoothness of the game, but not the responsiveness. And like, they both feel fairly responsive. And I don't know what else to tell you guys other than I bumped my camera. So at least on this high-end GPU, it does seem to be a pretty good experience for both of them. Now, one thing I'll say is in this particular game's implementation, The menus are a bit garbled using DLSS 3. As I pan between those, you can see some interpolation issues happening here where it kind of garbles on the way in between. And in the menus using FSR 3, and again, this is just the particular game implementation of this, because not every game's menu garbles like that on DLSS 3, but I will say at least in this particular game, the menus actually seem more stable without the garbling on, garbling's the technical term, on FSR 3. Again, the weird frame time graphs are not indicating the smoothness of actually playing the game. It feels smooth here. And that's my overall experience. Now, I have not tested Forspoken anywhere near as much as I have this. So I'd like to do a bit of that. And then the other thing I'd like to look at is just, given how many GPUs that this can support, I'd like to test it out on a whole bunch of other GPUs. Well, I hate to say it, but now that I've started playing Forspoken, so far I've spent almost all of my time testing this in Immortals of Aveum. I am less impressed here. So what are we looking at? I don't know, again, how much this will pick up in the YouTube video, but I'm doing on a controller a smooth camera pan, and it looks juddery. The frame pacing is not great, especially if I go at about this speed. It just feels like it's going in little shaky jumps. Now, if I go ahead and turn frame generation off, despite my frame rate now dropping to a much lower number, looks like we're in the 80s here, if I now do about that same speed of camera panning, it feels much smoother. The frame pacing of this feels significantly better, and, well, that's not a good sign for the frame generation technology here. Again, just kind of running around in this area with frame generation off at these settings. This is FSR 3 quality upscaling, and I think I'm on the high preset basically for the game. And we will drop into the 60s, a little bit below at times right here. The overall FSR 3 upscaling quality looks a little bit shimmery around the character as her arms pass through the grass and stuff. But again, that's the upscaling, just very similar to what we saw with FSR 2. It's just kind of imperfect here. And I've found that with FSR 2, a lot of times characters in a third-person game are one of the hardest things as their arms move and all that. But anyway, if I kick on frame generation again in this area, again, frame rate jumping up to around 120, although not quite hitting it. And then, again, I'm playing on a controller here, so I can tell you that the latency, at least on a controller, feels very good. The game feels responsive. I have no complaints about that. But again, it's just something didn't feel quite right with the frame pacing on the camera pans. Again, I'm going to pan the camera a little bit here, and it feels like it's jumping in little bursts, especially looking out this way. Actually, in this forest area looking this way, the camera pan feels a little bit better, and I think I actually run at a lower base frame rate staring at the forest than staring out this way. Staring out this way, the camera pan feels juddery, which is really interesting. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and kick FrameGen off, and again, I'll try that same camera pan with FrameGen off, and here it feels smooth. And over here also feels pretty smooth, despite the fact that we're running at a much lower frame rate. So overall, I've got to say that I'm much less impressed by the technology in Forspoken than I am in Immortals of Aveum. And so maybe this is going to be very game dependent. I don't know. All I've got to say is in Forspoken, I've played a lot less, but my initial impressions are I would probably keep it off if I was playing Forspoken, and I think I would keep it on when I was playing Immortals of Aveum. Now, with that in mind, before you judge it too harshly, I'm going to tell you right now that my thoughts on DLSS 3 frame generation are also generally, there are some games where I would turn it on. I feel like it's a net benefit. And there are some games where I would turn it off. And I feel like in the end, I prefer the experience without it, whether that's certain image quality artifacts that happen or just the feeling of playing the game with it enabled. But again, not in every area, but in certain areas, I definitely just feel like the camera pan is more juddery. And again, I'm able to use a controller to try to get that fairly consistent between the two. So far, while I would still not consider this a full FSR 3 review, I've got to say, out of the 2 games I'm able to use it in, one of them I think I'd leave it on, and one I think I would leave it off. And, when DLSS 3 first came out, I figured I mostly played it in Spider-Man and Plague Tale, and in Plague Tale I decided I would leave it on, and in Spider-Man I decided I would leave it off. So anyway, I do have a lot more testing on other GPUs I would like to do, but those are my thoughts so far in these 2 games on the 7900 XTX. All right, I think it makes sense to try out some other GPUs before we're done. So here we've popped in the RX 6700 XE, so a 6000 series GPU. Wanted to try that out. And so now we're running the game at 1080p. This is Immortals of Aveum again, where I felt like it worked better. And again, VSync on for smoothness. Right now we're at native AA setting, and then we'll try toggling FrameGen on and off. At 1080p, I don't really like upscaling, but we could try that too. So again, I'm getting a feeling for the movement of the game. Now, I can't say I will have played this as long as I did on the 7900 XTX. I did play that for hours to get a good feel for it. But just want to compare the initial impressions on some other GPUs here. Let me go ahead and kick frame generation on. So we're starting from a base of around 50 to 60. And it looks like that is pushing us up to 100-ish frames per second. In motion, I'm going to guess that that's going to dip a little bit. And I will say, the camera panning in motion absolutely does. I think this looks better visually to me. There's less gaps between frames, and I'm not noticing any immediate garbling. And the overall feel of it, again, feels pretty good to me. That might feel different to other people. Again, kicking FrameGen back off. Again, this just visually, I'm noticing a lot more gaps between frames on a quick camera pan, and I don't like that. Again, kicking the frame generation back on is immediately making the camera panning in my eye look better. Again, we're running at the native AA setting, so this is without that. Again, base frame rate only seemed to be in the like 40 to 60 range, depending on what exactly is happening, but it feels pretty responsive to me, and it looks reasonably okay. We could turn down the settings in the game to try to lock better to my monitor's refresh rate. Again, if you have VSync off, it does not look or feel anywhere near as good. The camera panning here with VSync off feels much, much worse. I don't know how much this is going to pick up in the camera, but again, make sure VSync is on when you're trying this out. Forgot to actually apply it. Here we go. VSync on. Again, that instantly looks a lot better and I think feels pretty good. And let's go ahead and I will try upscaling a little bit to boost the base frame rate a bit. So we might get more upscaling artifacts now. But that does feel a bit more responsive, and we are now locking closer to that 120 hertz monitor lock. And once again, I feel like choice between playing this with FrameGen on or off. In my limited experience with the 6700 XT, I would once again feel like in this particular game, by the way, those stutters are caused by the, I think just Unreal Engine traversal stutter. You get those as you run through here. But anyway, I think I would prefer FrameGen on to FrameGen off. Let me try out FrameGen off. Right here, leaving on the FSR quality for the higher base frame rate. Again, it still feels similarly responsive to me. It does maybe feel a little bit more floaty with FrameGen on. This might feel a little bit snappier. So there is definitely a latency hit to the generation. It does for sure exist. But once again, if I was playing at this setting, and the question was, is the experience improved by turning on frame generation? Again, it still feels responsive enough to me. Everybody might experience that differently, but it looks better to my eye with FrameGen on. I don't get those gaps between the frames, and I am taking advantage of my monitor's refresh rate. So Let's go ahead and maybe try this GPU in Forspoken and see if I get a similar feeling to what I got on the 7900 XTX. All right, this is now the 6700 XT in Forspoken, and once again, I feel like I get juddery camera motion looking this direction with FrameGen on. Although again, looking this direction doesn't seem as juddery. This one feels more juddery. Again, I think the base frame rate is higher here, so I wonder if that has something to do with the frame pacing issue that I'm noticing here. But again, we got FreeSync on, and FrameGen on. I think we're on the high preset overall graphically. We're gonna go FrameGen off. Let's see if that camera judder improves. Again, I feel like the camera motion feels significantly smoother here with FrameGen off. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. Basically, if I was playing this game and getting that juddery camera motion, I would turn off frame generation. It does not seem to improve the experience when I get juddery motion at times, even if at times it feels better. Seems a bit distracting to me. So overall, I think on the 6700 XT, I have the same conclusion I did on the 7900 XTX, which is FrameGen off in Forspoken, FrameGen on in Immortals of Aveum. However, it's possible that maybe there's some underlying setting or base frame rate that would make this camera panning feel better over here. But again, if I'm just a person playing the game, click the button on, kick the button off, feels bad here. So I'm going to say a no on this one. And overall, I feel like my initial impressions, like I said, are this is a good technology that I like in at least one of the two games that it's implemented in. And in this game, I think it has some promise and maybe could be improved, but just doesn't feel like currently up to the point I would use it in. Again, I didn't like completely beat Immortals of Aveum, and I've played even less of this. So obviously more experience in the games could update impressions, testing it on other GPUs, other settings, maybe even other screens that have a different refresh rate. I don't know, guys. I'd really love to see this technology get into more games. And I overall absolutely love that this is now available on so many GPUs. So I'm really excited to see what other channels that have more ability to do side-by-side comparisons and captures and things do with this stuff. So I'll be staying tuned with that for sure. And I will definitely be playing around with it on more GPUs. I chose to do the camera capture like this as I think the best way to give a somewhat representative idea of what this looks like on my screen, although again, it will never perfectly match. The camera shutter speed at 120 doesn't match the screen's refresh rate hertz at 120, especially if it's running in a variable refresh rate at all. And then, yeah, I mean, I don't know what to do, guys. Also, my camera can only capture at 1080p at 120, not at 4K, so this has been 1080p footage. All right, guys, I'll probably get some more videos out to you as I play with this more and probably also testing it on other GPUs. I'm curious about NVIDIA 2030 and, hey, maybe even 10 series GPUs just to see what happens. It should be supported back to the 20 series, recommended on the 30 series, and not supported at all on the 10 series, although that doesn't mean you can't try turning it on. And I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts about it in the comment section for whatever you've tried. And I hope you all have an excellent day.